Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Adventure and Mystery Book Club. I'm Bill Mallory, branch manager of the La Jolla Library. I'm so glad you could be with me today as we read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. So, if you remember from our previous, we're going to read chapters 33 and 34 today. If you remember from our previous reading on Monday, uh, our heroes were getting set to abandon the Nautilus. They were going to sneak out and get away from Captain Nemo and paddle their way uh, in the dinghy that is attached to the Nautilus and make their way to the shore because they were close enough to Europe where they felt it was possible to do it. Only a couple of miles away from the coast, so they had these grand plans and Ned Land, the harpooner, was all ready to go, and everyone else was going to help him. When Captain Nemo sinks the Nautilus to the bottom of the ocean, they have reached a place called Vigo Bay, and when asked, hey, why is this happening? Why are we at the bottom of the ocean here in Vigo Bay? And Captain Nemo tells him a story of a war that was going on between the French and the British, and there was a ship and that held large quantities of gold and silver, and the crew was French and Spanish. They were sort of a combined group, and all these ships were being pursued by the English ships, and so they took to a port in Vigo Bay, and unfortunately, it was not a good place to stay. And they, after much fighting and a lot of back and forth battles, it was pretty clear that the French were going to lose. And rather than let the gold get into the hands of the English, they set fire to their own ships, and so they would sink to the bottom of the ocean. And it is here that Captain Nemo reveals that he gets all of his money. It's sunken ships carrying large quantities of gold and silver that allow him to do what he does, and pay for everything in pure gold. And you might recall there was a scene chapters ago, like maybe 10 chapters ago or so, where he is communicating with someone from the surface, although this person comes to the Nautilus, and he gives him some gold as payment, and this is the result of that. This is, we find out now where he's getting the gold from. So on the one hand, they have learned a little bit more about Captain Nemo, but on the other hand, they have did not get a chance to escape like they were hoping. They are now on their way to the island of Crete, where there is apparently a rebellion going on, and we'll find out what is going on with that in just a moment here. As we start, let me get my book ready here. Chapter 33, entitled A Lost Continent. On the next day, February 19th, the Canadian entered my room. I had been expecting him to visit me. He looked very disappointed. "Well, monsieur," he said. "Yesterday our luck wasn't with us, Ned. That darn captain would stop just as we're about to leave." "Yes, Ned, he had to see his banker." "His banker? Or rather, his bank. I mean the ocean, where wealth is even safer than in the coffers of a state." I told the Canadian what had happened the night before, with the secret hope of making him give up the idea of leaving. But my recital had no other effect on Ned than making him regret he himself hadn't taken a stroll over the battlefield of Vigo. "But everything's not over," he said. "The harpoon missed its mark that time, that's all. But we'll succeed next time, tonight if we have to." "What is the Nautilus's direction?" I asked. "I don't know," answered Ned. "Well then, at noon we'll find our position. We'll find out our position." The Canadian went back to Kinsale. As soon as I had dressed, I went to the lounge. The compass was not reassuring. The Nautilus was heading south by southwest. We were turning our backs on Europe. I waited somewhat impatiently for our position to be marked on the chart. Toward 11:30, the reservoirs were emptied and the submarine rose to the surface. I rushed out on the platform. Ned Land was already there. No more coastline in sight, nothing but vast sea. Several sails on the horizon, probably of ships going all the way to Cape San Roque to find favorable winds to carry them around the Cape of Good Hope. The sky was clouded with a wind blowing up. Ned was furious and tried desperately to pierce the misty horizon. He still hoped that behind the fog he could see the land for which he so longed. At noon, the sun shone through for a moment. The first mate took advantage of this to take his bearings. Then, since the sea was getting rough, we went below and the hatch was closed. When I consulted the chart an hour later, I saw that the Nautilus was at 16 degrees 17 minutes west longitude and 33 degrees 22 minutes north latitude, 325 miles from the nearest shore. It was no use even thinking about escape. I leave the reader to imagine Ned's anger when I told him of our situation. As for me, I was not too unhappy. I felt as if a weight had been taken off of my chest, and I was able to go back to work with relative calm. Excuse me. Ooh, that just snuck right up on me. At about 11 o'clock at night, I received a very unexpected visit from Captain Nemo. He asked me very politely if I was tired from having been up so late the previous night. I said I wasn't. "Then, Monsieur Aronnax, I would like to invite you on a rather curious excursion." "What sort of excursion, Captain?" "So far you have only seen the ocean depths during the day when the sun is out. How would you like to see them on a dark night?" "Very much." "This excursion will be tiring, I warn you. We'll have to do a lot of walking and mountain climbing. The roads aren't very well kept up." "Your description only increases my curiosity. I'm ready to go." "Splendid. Let's go put on our diving suits." When I got to the dressing room, I saw that neither my companions nor any member of the crew were to go with us. Captain Nemo had made no mention of inviting Ned or Conseil. It only took us a few minutes to put on our suits. The tanks, filled with considerable amounts of air, were put on our backs, but we weren't given our electric lamps. I mentioned this to the captain. "We won't need them," he answered. I thought I had not heard him correctly, but I could not repeat what I had said, for the captain's head had already disappeared inside the metal helmet. When I finished my preparations, I felt an iron-tipped stick being placed in my hand, and several minutes later, after the usual operations, we set foot on the floor of the Atlantic at a depth of 1,000 feet. It was almost midnight. The water was completely dark, but Captain Nemo showed me a reddish spot, a kind of large gleam shining about 2 miles away from the Nautilus. What this fire was, what was feeding it, why it was burning at all in the midst of the water, I had no idea. But in any case, it lit our way dimly, to be sure, but I soon became accustomed to the darkness, and realized that the Ruhmkorff lamps had really not been necessary. Captain Nemo and I, walking near each other, headed straight for the spot of light. The flat ground started to rise a bit. We took large strides, helping ourselves along with our sticks. But all the same, our progress was slow, for our feet often sank in a kind of mud mixed with seaweed and strewn with flat stones. As we walked, I could hear a kind of crackling overhead, a continual pattern that would occasionally increase a bit in intensity. I soon understood what caused it. It was rain pounding on the surface of the ocean. I found myself worrying about getting soaked. Soaked by water in the midst of water. I could not help laughing at such a crazy idea, but to tell the truth, in a thick diving costume, one has no sensation of being in water. It feels rather as if one were in the midst of a slightly denser atmosphere than that above the surface, and nothing more. After we had walked for half an hour, the ground became rocky. Jellyfish, microscopic shellfish, and sea pens lit up with their glimmers of phosphorescence. I could make out heaps of stone covered with masses of zoophytes and seaweed. I often slipped on this viscous bed of marine plants, and I would have fallen more than once had it not been for my stick. When I turned around, I could still make out the whitish light from the Nautilus growing paler in the distance. The heaps of rocks I have just mentioned were laid out on the ocean floor with a certain regularity of pattern that I could not explain. I noticed gigantic furrows, which went off into the murky distance, and whose length it was impossible to calculate. There were also other details which struck me as even more incredible. It seemed as if my heavy lead soles were trampling on a litter of bones, making them crack with a dry sound. What was this vast plain we were crossing? I wanted to ask the captain, but unfortunately I did not know the sign language he and his companions used under water. Nevertheless, the reddish light guiding us was growing larger, and it now lit up the entire horizon. This source of light beneath the surface of the sea aroused my curiosity to the highest degree. Was it some electrical phenomenon? Was I about to see something unknown to scientists on land? Or was this thing, for the thought occurred to me, produced by the hands of man? Was I going to meet at these great depths companions or friends of Captain Nemo living an existence as strange as his and whom he was now going to visit? Would I find there a whole colony of exiles who had grown weary of a miserable existence on earth and had sought and found freedom in the ocean depths? All these mad, inadmissible ideas raced through my brain, and with my mind constantly overstimulated by one wonder after another, I would not have been surprised to encounter one of those underwater cities of which Captain Nemo dreamed. Our path grew lighter and lighter. The whitish gleam came from the top of a mountain about 800 feet high. But what I saw was only a reflection produced by the water itself. The source of this mysterious light was on the opposite side of the mountain. Captain Nemo pushed on unhesitatingly through the maze of rocks covering the floor of the Atlantic. He knew this dark route. He had undoubtedly been here often, and there was no danger of his getting lost. I followed him with unshakable confidence. He seemed like a spirit of the waters, and when he walked in front of me, I admired his tall build outlined in black against the lights on the horizon. It was 1 in the morning. We had arrived at the foot of the mountain, but in order to climb it, we had to go up difficult paths through a vast forest. Yes, it was a forest of dead trees, without leaves or sap, trees petrified by the sea, with an occasional gigantic pine towering high into the water. It was like a coal field still standing, holding on to the furrowed soil with its roots, and its branches looking as if they had been delicately cut out of black paper. The reader might get some idea of it by trying to imagine the forest clinging to the sides of the Harz Mountains, but all underwater. The paths were cluttered with seaweed and sea wrack, and among it crawled a whole world of shellfish. I climbed up rocks and stepped over fallen tree trunks, breaking the sea vines stretching from one tree to another, and startling the fish flying from branch to branch. In my excitement, I no longer felt any fatigue. I followed my guide, who never seemed to tire. What a sight! How can I describe it? How can I depict the spectacle of these woods and rocks in the midst of the water, their undersides dark and forbidding, their upper sides tinted with the red light, whose intensity was increased as it was reflected by the water? We would climb over rocks, enormous chunks of which would then fall down with mute rumbling sound of an avalanche. On either side of the path were hollowed out dark caves, in which one could see nothing, and I occasionally wondered if some inhabitant of these underwater regions was not suddenly going to spring up before me. But Captain Nemo kept on climbing. I did not want to lag behind, and I followed boldly. My stick helped me greatly. One false step would have been dangerous on these narrow paths beside huge chasms, but I walked resolutely without the slightest feeling of giddiness. Sometimes I would jump over a crevasse whose depth would have made me hesitate had it been in a glacier on dry land. Other times I would venture out on the wobbling trunk of a tree fallen over the top of an abyss without looking down, only interested in admiring the wild scenery of the region. There were huge rocks resting on strangely shaped bases, leaning as if to defy the laws of gravity. Between their stony joints, trees sprouted up like jets of water under great pressure and supported other trees, which in turn helped support them. Then there were natural towers with sheer walls between them, all leaning at an angle that would have been impossible on land. And I could also feel a difference brought about by the density of the water, for in spite of my heavy costume, my copper helmet and metal soles, I could climb up almost impossibly steep slopes with the agility of an izzard or chamois. I realized that my description of this underwater excursion must be scarcely credible, but I am fated to recount things which, although apparently impossible, are in fact real and undeniable. It wasn't a dream, but something I saw and felt. 2 hours after leaving the Nautilus, we had passed the tree line, and 100 feet above us the mountain peak, which stood between us and the brilliant light coming from the other side. Several petrified shrubs ran in twisting zigzag lines. Schools of fish rose from beneath our feet, like birds flushed in high grass. The massive rocks were rent with impenetrable crevasses, deep caves and unfathomable holes at the bottom of which one could hear formidable creatures moving. My blood would curdle when I would see a huge feeler blocking my path, or hear a frightful pincers snapping shut in the shadows of some hollow. Thousands of luminous spots shone in the midst of the darkness. They were the eyes of giant shellfish hidden in their lairs, huge lobsters drawing themselves up like soldiers and moving their claws with a metallic clanking noise, titanic crabs set like guns on their carriages, and frightful octopuses intertwining their tentacles like an underbrush of live snakes. What was this luxuriant world I did not yet know? What kind of creatures were these for whom the rock formed a second shell? Where had nature found the secret of their plant-like existence, and for how many centuries had they been living like this in the deepest layers of the ocean? But I could not stop. Captain Nemo was already familiar with these terrible animals and no longer paid any attention to them. We arrived on a plateau where yet other surprises were awaiting me. I made out picturesque ruins which betrayed the hand of man and no longer that of the Creator. There were vast heaps of stone, among which one could make out vague shapes of castles and temples, decked in a whole world of zoophyte and flowers, which were covered not with ivy, but with a mantle of seaweed. But what was this part of the globe swallowed by some cataclysm? Who had laid out these rocks and stones like the dolmens of prehistoric times? Where was I? What was this place to which Captain Nemo had led me? I wanted to ask him, but since I could not, I stopped and seized his arm. He merely shook his head and pointed to the higher point on the mountain, as if to say, "Come on, follow me further on." I followed him in the last burst of effort, and in several minutes I had climbed the peak, rising 50 or so feet above the surrounding mass of rocks. I looked back to the slopes we had just climbed. There the mountain only rose 700 or 800 feet above the plain, but on the other side it rose twice that height over a deeper portion of the ocean. My eyes wandered in the distance, and I saw a vast space lit by violent flashes. This mountain was, in fact, a volcano. 50 feet below the peak, in the midst of a rain of stones and cinders, a large crater vomited forth torrents of lava which spread out in a fiery cascade in the midst of the waters. Placed as it was, this volcano acted like an immense torch, lighting up the lower plain out to the farthest reaches of the horizon. This underwater crater threw up lava, but no flames. Flames need oxygen from the air, and they cannot exist underwater, but streams of incandescent lava can achieve a reddish-white color, struggle victoriously against the surrounding water, and become vaporized upon contact. Fast currents carried off all these diffused gases, and the torrents of lava slid to the base of the mountain like those of Vesuvius threatening another Torre del Greco. And in fact, there, beneath my eyes, ruined, crumbled, and destroyed, lay a town with its roofs caved in, its temples falling down, its arches out of place, and its columns lying on the ground. In all these fragments one could see the solid proportions of a kind of Tuscan architecture. Farther on there were the remains of a giant aqueduct. Here lay an encrusted mound of some acropolis, with the floating forms of a Parthenon. There the remains of a dock, as if some antique port that had once sheltered merchant ships and triremes of war at the shore of an extinct sea. Yet further on, long lines of crumbling walls and deserted streets. Captain Nemo was showing me an entire Pompeii buried beneath the ocean. Where was I? I had to know. I wanted to speak. I wanted to tear off the copper helmet enclosing my head. But Captain Nemo came over and took me by the arm. He then picked up a piece of chalky stone and went over to a rock of black basalt, where he wrote only a single word: Atlantis. Suddenly everything became clear. This was the ancient Meropis of Theopompus, the Atlantis of Plato. This was the continent in which Origen, Porphyry, Iamblichus, D'Anville, Malte Brun, and Humboldt had said was pure legend, as opposed to Posidonius, Pliny, Marcellinus, Ammianus, Tertullian, Engel, Scherer, Tournefort, Buffon, and de Avezac, who believed it had really existed. There it was before my eyes, with undeniable evidence of its catastrophic end. This was that submerged region which had once existed beyond Europe, Asia, or Libya, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and inhabited by powerful Atlantides, uh, against whom the early Greeks had fought. It was Plato himself who has written the history of these mighty deeds of far-off heroic times. His dialogues with Timaeus and uh, Critias were written, so to speak, under the inspiration of Solon, the poet and lawmaker. One day Solon was chatting with several wise men of Sais, a city already 800 years old, as witnessed by the annals engraved on the sacred wall of its temple. One of those old men recounted the history of another city, yet 1,000 years older, the first Athenian city, 900 centuries old, had been invaded and partly destroyed by the Atlantides. These people, he said, occupied an immense continent larger than Africa and Asia put together, and stretching from 12 degrees to 40 degrees north latitude. Their sway extended even to Egypt. They also tried to conquer Greece, but they had been forced to retreat before the indomitable resistance of the Hellenes. Centuries went by, and then suddenly they were overtaken by a cataclysm, with floods and earthquakes. One night and one day were enough to annihilate Atlantis, whose highest summits, the Madeira Islands, the Azores, the Canaries, and the Cape Verde Islands, still emerge above the surface of the sea. Such were the historical memories evoked by Captain Nemo's inscription. Thus, through the strangest of destinies, I was now standing on a mountain of this lost continent. My hand was touching ruins thousands of centuries old, contemporary with geological epochs. I was walking over the very ground tread by the contemporaries of earliest mankind. My heavy soles were crushing the skeletons of ancient animals, which these now petrified trees had once covered with their shade. Ah, why there was so little time. How I would have liked to go down the steep slopes of the mountain and cross the entire huge continent stretching from Africa to America, visiting its great prehistoric cities. I was, perhaps, now looking at Makimos, a warrior city, or Eusebos, the pious city whose gigantic inhabitants lived for entire centuries and who had strength enough to build with blocks of stone which still stood up against the action of the water. Maybe one day volcanic action would bring these sunken ruins back to the surface. Many underground volcanoes have been observed in this part of the ocean, and ships have often been violently tossed about while passing over these tortured regions. Some have heard muted sounds indicating a struggle of the elements deep down. Others have picked up volcanic ash thrown up into the air. As far as the equator, this area is still prey to the Earth's eruptive forces, and who knows but that in the distant future the summits of these underwater mountains may be raised up again by a volcanic ash and successive layers of lava, and once again appear above the surface of the Atlantic. While I was dreaming about all this and trying to fix in my memory all the details of this grandiose landscape, Captain Nemo was leaning on a mossy slab of stone without moving, as if petrified in mute ecstasy. Was he thinking of those generations long since dead and asking them the secret of human destiny? Was it here that this strange man came to steep himself in history and relive the life of ancient times? He who would have nothing to do with the world around him. How much I would have given to know his thoughts, to share and understand them. We stayed there for a whole hour, contemplating the vast plain lit by the hot lava, which occasionally took on surprising brilliance. Sometimes an underground bubbling would make the mountain tremble. Noises from the deep, clearly transmitted by the water, resounded with majestic grandeur. For an instant, the moon appeared and threw its pale rays on the sunken continent. It was only a glimmer, but the effect was indescribable. The captain straightened up, took one last look at the vast plain, and then motioned for me to follow him. It took us little time to climb back down the mountain. Once we had gotten past the petrified forest, I made out the Nautilus's light shining like a star. The captain made straight for it, and we were back on board just as the first rays of dawn were whitening the surface of the ocean. Chapter 34: The Underwater Coal Mines. The next day, February 20th, I got up very late. I had been so tired from the night before that I slept until 11 o'clock. I got dressed quickly. I was anxious to find out the Nautilus's direction. The instruments told me that it was still heading south at a speed of 20 knots and at a depth of 300 feet. Conseil entered. I told him about our excursion of the previous night, and since the panels were open, he could still make out part of this submerged continent. For the Nautilus was cruising only 30 feet above the plain of Atlantis. It scurried along like a balloon carried by the wind over earthly prairies. But it would be nearer the truth to say that we sat in this lounge as if in the carriage of an express train. In the foreground we could see rocks hewn into fantastic shapes, and forests of trees which had passed to the mineral from the vegetable kingdom, and whose immobile silhouettes stood out grimly beneath the ocean. There were also masses of rock buried under layers of axidae and anemones, and bristling with long vertical marine plants. Among these I could make out strangely shaped blocks of lava bearing witness to the fury of volcanic action. While this peculiar scenery was gleaming beneath our electric light, I told Conseil the history of Atlantis, which, from the purely fictional point of view, had inspired Bailey to write so many charming pages. I told him about the wars of these heroic people and discussed the question of Atlantis from the point of view of a man who no longer entertained the slightest doubt. But Conseil seemed distracted and not really listening, and I soon realized what caused this indifference to matters of history. Numerous fish were attracting his attention, and when fish passed by, Conseil would become lost in the abyss of classification and leave the world of reality. In a situation like that, I could do nothing but follow his lead and once again take up our study of marine life. These fish in the Atlantic, however, differed little from those we had already seen. There were gigantic rays, 15 feet long and powerful enough to leap out of the water, various kinds of sharks, and among them one blue-green in color and 15 feet long, with sharp triangular teeth, and so transparent as to be almost invisible in the water. Brown sargos, humantins shaped like prisms and armored with a tubular skin, with a tubercular skin, sturgeons similar to their cousins in the Mediterranean, and pipefishes 18 inches long, yellowish brown in color with little gray fins, lacking teeth or tongue, which passed by like delicate, supple snakes. Among the class of bony fish, Conseil noted some blackish macares, 10 feet long and armed with a sharp sword on their upper jaw, brightly colored stingfish, known in Aristotle's time as sea dragons, and very dangerous to pick up because of the spines on their dorsal fin. Spiny dolphins, their brown backs striped with blue and edged with gold. Lovely dorados, moonfish resembling discs with a bluish glint, which, when lit from above by the sun's rays, looked like spots of silver. And finally, swordfish, 25 feet long, swimming in schools, waving their sickle-shaped fins and brandishing their 6-foot swords. These fearless animals eat plants rather than other fish, and obey the least signal from their females, like all well-trained husbands. But while observing these various specimens of marine life, I never grew tired of examining the long plains of Atlantis. Sometimes capricious alterations in the terrain would force the Nautilus to slow down and slip like a whale through the narrow passes between hills. And if the maze became impossible, it would merely rise like an airship, go over the obstacle, and then once again take up its rapid course a few feet from the ocean floor, above the ocean floor. It was an admirable and charming way to travel, somewhat like being in a balloon, but with the important difference that the Nautilus responded instantly to the helmsman's command. Toward 4 in the afternoon, the terrain, which till then had been composed mainly of thick mud intermingled with petrified branches, began to change little by little. It became more stony and seemed littered with a conglomerate and basalt mixed with bits of lava and sulphurous obsidian. I felt sure that the long plains would soon end in mountains, and indeed, I could soon see that the southern horizon was blocked by a high wall which seemed to bar all roads. Its summit obviously rose above the surface. It must have been a continent, or at least an island, either one of the Canaries or one of the Cape Verde Islands. Since our position had not been marked on the chart, perhaps on purpose, I did not know where we were. In any case, such a wall seemed to mark the end of Atlantis, of which we had covered only a small portion. Night interrupted my observations. I remained alone when Conseil went back to his cabin. The Nautilus reduced its speed and hovered over the ocean floor, sometimes almost touching it as if it wanted to settle on the bottom, and sometimes capriciously going back up to the surface. Through the crystalline waters, I could make out several bright constellations, and specifically 5 or 6 of the zodiacal signs behind horizon. The zodiacal stars behind Orion. There we go. I would gladly have remained at the window much longer, admiring the beauties of sea and sky, but the panels closed. Just then the Nautilus had arrived before the sheer face of a wall. I had no idea what sort of maneuvers it was trying to make. I went back to my room. The Nautilus was no longer moving. I went to sleep with the firm resolve of getting up after several hours. But on the next day, it was past 8 when I returned to the lounge. I looked at the pressure gauge of the Nautilus was floating on the surface. Moreover, I could hear the sound of footsteps on the platform, but there was no rolling or pitching. I went up the companionway. The hatch was open. But instead of bright daylight I had expected, I found myself surrounded by total darkness. Where were we? Had I made a mistake? Was it still night? No, not a single star was shining, and besides, night is never as totally dark as that. I didn't know what to think, when suddenly a voice said, "Is that you, Professor?" "Oh, Captain Nemo," I answered. "Where are we?" "Underground, Professor." "Underground?" I cried. "But the Nautilus is still floating." "It always floats." "I don't understand. Wait a minute till our light is turned on and everything will be cleared up. I got out of I got out on the platform and waited. It was so dark that I couldn't even see Captain Nemo, but directly overhead I thought I could make out a vague glimmer, a kind of half-light filtering through a round hole. Just then the searchlight suddenly was turned on, and its strong beam made this dim light vanish. For a moment my eyes were completely dazzled, but soon I could open them and look around. The Nautilus was moored to a bank shaped like a dock. It was floating in a lake enclosed within circular walls 2 miles in diameter, or, in other words, 6 miles in circumference. The level of the lake, this fact was confirmed by the pressure gauge, was necessarily the same as that outside, for there had to be a passage between this lake and the ocean. The high walls curved in to form a vault like a huge upside-down funnel, 1,500 to 2,000 feet high. At the top, there was a round hole through which daylight could enter. This explained the vague glimmer I had seen. Before examining the inside of this enormous cavern more carefully, and asking myself if it had been made by nature or by man, I went over and asked Captain Nemo, "Where are we?" "At the center of an extinct volcano," replied the captain, "that was invaded by the sea after some convulsion of the earth. While you were sleeping, Professor, the Nautilus entered this lagoon through a channel 30 feet below the surface of the ocean. This is my harbor, safe, convenient, secret, and sheltered from any wind. Find me a single harbor on the coasts of your continents that is so protected as this one from the fury of gales." "Yes," I replied, "you are certainly safe here, Captain Nemo. Who could ever disturb you in the middle of a volcano? But I didn't see an opening at the top. But didn't I see an opening at the top?" "Yes, that is the crater which was once filled with lava, steam, and flames. But now it merely brings us the air we breathe." "But what mountain is this?" I asked. "It's one of those innumerable little islands which dot the surface of the ocean. For ships, it's just a reef to be avoided. For us, it's an immense cavern. I discovered it quite by chance, and this was a great stroke of luck for me." "But couldn't someone enter through that hole at the top?" "No more than I could get out through it. The inside base of this mountain can be climbed for about 100 feet up, but above that the walls lean in, and nobody could scale them." "I can see that nature helps you wherever you go, Captain. You're safe in this lake, and no one could visit these waters. But what good is this refuge? The Nautilus doesn't need a harbor." "No, Professor, but it needs electricity for its power. Batteries to produce the electricity, sodium for the batteries, coal to make the sodium, and therefore coal mines to get the coal. In this very spot there are whole forests which were buried millions of years ago. Now they have turned to coal, and for me they are an inexhaustible mine." "So here, Captain, your men act as miners." "That's right. These mines reach out beneath the ocean like those of Newcastle. My men, dressed in their diving suits and equipped with pick and shovel, go down to extract the coal, thereby making me independent of dry land, even for that substance. When I burn it to make sodium, the smoke which escapes through the crater will merely makes this mountain look like a volcano that's still active." "Will I see your companions doing this?" "No, not this time, for I'm in a hurry to continue our underwater tour of the Earth. Now I shall merely take sodium from my reserve stock. We'll stay here long enough to put it on board, which won't take any more than 1 day, and then we'll be on our way again. So if you want to see this cavern and take a walk around the lake, take advantage of what time you have today, Monsieur Aronnax." I thanked the captain and went to get my two companions, who had not yet left their cabin. I invited them to come along without telling them where they were. We climbed up onto the platform. Conseil, who was never surprised by anything, acted as if it was perfectly natural to wake up under a mountain after going to sleep under the sea. But Ned Land had only one idea: to see if there was some way out of the cavern. After breakfast at about 10 o'clock, we got off onto the bank. "Here we are on land again," said Conseil. "This isn't exactly what I call land," replied the Canadian. "And besides, we're not on it, but under it." Between the base of the mountain walls and the lake itself, there was a sandy shoreline 500 feet across at the widest point. On this beach, one could easily walk around the lake. The base of the high walls was a picturesque pile of volcanic rocks and enormous pumice stones. All these broken fragments had been polished by subterranean fires and glistened beneath the ship's electric light. Along the shore, mica dust, kicked up by our feet, rose up like clouds of sparks. As we got away from the water's edge, the ground rose considerably, and we soon arrived at some long, narrow ramps, abrupt paths on which we could climb slowly. But we had to walk carefully over those loose stones and the slippery, glass-like trachyte made of feldspar and quartz crystals. Every detail of this enormous cavern, as I pointed out to my companions, confirmed its volcanic origin. "Can you imagine what this funnel must have been like," I said, "when it was full of boiling lava rising to the crater on top like molten metal in a furnace?" "I could well imagine what it was like," replied Conseil. "But could monsieur tell me why this particular furnace went out of operation and was replaced by calm lake water?" "Very probably, Conseil, because the earth, as it shook and trembled, opened up an underwater channel, the one through which the Nautilus passed, allowing the sea water to rush in. This must have been followed by a terrible struggle between these two elements, with the ocean finally winning. But many centuries have passed by since then, and now the submerged volcano is nothing but a peaceful cavern." "That's all very fine," retorted Ned Land, "but it's too bad for us that this channel formed underwater." "But Ned," replied Conseil, "if it hadn't been underwater, the Nautilus could not have gotten in." "And what's more, Ned, the ocean couldn't have entered this, and this cavern would still be a volcano. So your regrets don't make much sense." We continued to climb. The path became steeper and narrower. Sometimes there were deep gaps we had to jump across. Sometimes great rocks we had to go around. Occasionally we had to crawl on our hands and knees, and even on our bellies. But between Conseil's skill and the Canadian's strength, we overcame all these obstacles. When we were about 100 feet up, the terrain changed, but without becoming any easier for us. We were now in an area of black basalt, in some places all eaten away and honeycombed, in others forming regularly shaped prisms, which supported the vaulting in a splendid display of natural architecture. Among these basalt rocks ran long trickles of hardened lava streaked with coal and occasionally covered with broad layers of sulfur. The light entering from the overhead crater was now stronger, dimly illuminating our path among these volcanic formations forever buried in the heart of this mountain. At a height of about 250 feet, a series of impassable obstacles prevented us from climbing further. The interior vaulting began to lean in sharply, and we therefore had to start walking horizontally around the inside of the mountain. At this level, the vegetable kingdom began its struggle for existence. There were several shrubs and even a few trees growing out of cracks in the wall. I saw spurge with its bitter sap seeping from its bark. There were heliotropes unable to justify their name since the sun's rays never reached them, with their bunches of flowers hanging down half wilted. Here and there several chrysanthemums grew timidly at the foot of sad and sickly-looking long-leafed aloes. But between the stream of dried lava I noticed little violets, and I must confess to having sniffed them with delight. Scent is the soul of flowers, and sea flowers, as splendid as they may be, have no soul. We had reached a clump of hardy dragon trees, prying the rocks apart with their powerful roots, when suddenly Ned Land cried, "Monsieur, a beehive!" "A beehive?" I cried with a gesture of disbelief. "Yeah, a beehive," repeated the Canadian, "and with the bees buzzing around it." I drew nearer and was forced to believe what I saw. There, around a hole in the trunk of a dragon tree, swarmed several thousand of those clever insects which are so common on the Canary Islands and whose produce is so highly esteemed. Naturally, the Canadian wanted to stock up on honey, but I could not very well say no. He mixed some dried leaves with sulphur, lit them with his flint, and began to smoke out the bees. Little by little the buzzing ceased, and the hive, after being broken open, yielded several pounds of perfumed honey. Ned Land filled his haversack with it. "I'll mix this honey with breadfruit paste," he said, "and we'll have a really delicious cake." "Or rather gingerbread," said Conseil. "Never mind the gingerbread," I said. "Let's keep walking." From several points on our path we could see the entire lake. The light from the submarine lit up its whole peaceful surface. The Nautilus was completely immobile. On its platform and on the shore, members of the crew were milling about, looking like black shadows clearly outlined in the luminous atmosphere. Now we reached the highest crest of that wall of rocks supporting the vault. I saw then that bees were not the only animals inside this volcano. Birds of prey soared and whirled here and there in the shadows, or fled from their nests on the tips of rocks. There were sparrowhawks with white bellies and screeching kestrels. There were also fine, fat bustards, scampering over the slopes as fast as their legs could carry them. I shall let the reader imagine how the Canadian's appetite was whetted at the sight of such tasty game bird, and how he regretted not having a gun with him. He tried using stones instead of bullets, and after several fruitless attempts, he succeeded in wounding one of these splendid bustards. But it was no exaggeration to say that he risked his life 20 times in order to get the bird, but finally it was placed in his haversack along with the honeycombs. We then had to go back down, for we could climb no further. The yawning crater above us looked like the mouth of a large well. We could now see the sky quite clearly, with scattered clouds scudding along and occasionally grazing the top of the mountain. This was certain proof that the clouds were not very high, for the volcano did not rise more than 800 feet above the surface of the ocean. A half an hour after the Canadian's last exploit, we reached the shore of the lake. There the vegetable kingdom was represented by blankets of sea fennel, that umbrella-shaped plant, which makes such a good preserve. Conseil picked several bunches of it. As for the animal life, it consisted of thousands of shellfish of all sorts, lobsters, crabs, prawns, musses, spider crabs, and a prodigious number of shells, cowries, morises, and limpets. While we were standing there, we spotted the mouth of a magnificent cave. My companions and I delightedly stretched out on its fine sand. Fire had polished its sparkling, enameled walls sprinkled with mica dust. Ned Land felt the walls and tried to see how thick they were. I could not help smiling. The conversation then turned to his eternal plans for escaping, and I felt I could give him the following hope without too great a risk of being wrong, namely, that Captain Nemo had headed south only to renew his supply of sodium. I felt he would now return to the coasts of Europe or America, thus permitting the Canadian to have another and more successful try at escaping. The conversation had been very lively at first, but after we had been stretched out in this cave for about an hour, it began to lag. A certain drowsiness came over us, and since there was no reason not to give in, I let myself fall into a deep sleep. I dreamed. One doesn't choose one's dreams. That my life had been reduced to the simple vegetable-like existence of a mollusk. It seemed as if the cave formed the double valve of my shell. Suddenly I was awakened by Conseil, shouting, "Wake up! Wake up!" What is it?" I asked, sitting up. We are being swamped." I got up. The sea was rushing into our cave, and since we weren't mollusks, we had to get out. In a few moments, we had climbed to safety above the cave. "What's going on?" "What's going on?" asked Conseil. "Is this some new phenomenon?" "No, my friends," I answered. "It's just the tide. It came close to catching us the way it did Sir Walter Scott's hero. The ocean outside is rising, and by a natural law of equilibrium, the level of the lake is also rising. We're lucky nothing worse happened than getting half wet. Let's go back to the Nautilus and change." 3/4 of an hour later, we had completed our circular walk and were back on board. The sailors had just finished loading the sodium, and the Nautilus could have left then and there. But Captain Nemo gave no orders for departure. Did he want to wait for the night and leave secretly by his underwater channel? Perhaps. Whatever the reason, by the next day the Nautilus had left its port and was cruising several yards below the surface of the Atlantic, far from any land. And that, my friends, is the end of chapter 34. We will continue again in 2 days on Friday at 4 p.m., and we'll read the next 2 chapters. Thank you very much for being here with me today. I hope you are reading along, and we will see you again on Friday. Bye, everyone.